Hey guys, tonight we begin with the charming, cozy, heartwarming world of Victorian factory life. You know, that magical era when children worked 12-hour shifts and the air quality could legally be classified as a weapon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first day as a Victorian factory worker begins the same way all Victorian tragedies begin, with a bell. Not a gentle good morning chime. No, this bell rings like it's personally offended that you're still alive. It's pitch black outside. The sun has refused to participate. Even the rats are still asleep, and they work night shifts. But you must rise. You peel yourself off a straw mattress that feels like someone angrily stuffed a potato sack with regrets and sharp objects. Your back cracks like an old wooden door. Your joints send you a message that translates roughly to, "Why are we doing this?" Your breath forms a white cloud in the freezing air. That's right. You are so cold, you are producing your own special effects. Your breakfast is yesterday's bread, which has achieved the density of a medieval weapon. You try to bite it, and your teeth file an official protest. No butter, no jam, no coffee, because caffeine is a luxury for the rich and the French. Victorian workers started their day fueled entirely by survival instinct and pure negativity. You get dressed in clothes that can only be described as historically itchy. Every fiber feels like it was designed by someone who hated skin. They're stiff, they're heavy, and they smell like the combined scenes of every person who wore them before you. You step outside, ready to embrace the day, and immediately reconsider every choice that led you here. The air is a charming blend of soot, coal, smoke, damp fog, and something that can only be described as urban sadness. Someone coughs nearby, and the sound echoes like a haunted accordion. A child runs past you already late for their 12-hour shift because, in Victorian England, childhood was more of a rumor than a reality. The street is slick with slime you don't want to identify. Your shoes, which are essentially cardboard lined with hope, soak through instantly. Congratulations, your day begins with trench foot light. Then the factory bell rings again, this time louder, like it has taken your reluctance personally. You start walking faster, not because you want to, but because Victorian foremen are legally allowed to yell at you until your soul leaves your body. And the worst part, you haven't even reached the factory yet. You haven't seen the machines. You haven't inhaled the dust. You haven't met the foreman whose personality is unseasoned boiled potato. It's still morning, and already you're thinking, "No, I will not survive this. I'm going back to bed." Your commute to the factory is not a charming morning walk. There is no sunrise, no bird song, no cheerful neighbor wishing you a lovely day. Instead, you step out into a Victorian street that looks like a deleted scene from a horror novel. The fog is so thick it has physical mass, the color of wet cement, and it carries the delightful scent of industrial revolution and unresolved coughing fits. The ground beneath you is not a road, so much as a mudden soot smoothie. Every footstep threatens to remove your shoe entirely, which would be tragic because Victorian shoes cost approximately 2 years of wages and provide exactly 0 warmth. As you walk, you encounter the local wildlife rats, the size of emotional support dogs. They don't fear you, they don't run. They simply look at you like, oh, you're headed to the factory. Rough. Even the rats pity you. And that should tell you everything. You pass rows of cramped houses where families of 8 live in one room, all of them sharing the same air, diseases, and questionable life choices. Laundry hangs limply in the damp air, dripping onto the street because sunlight hasn't visited this neighborhood since the reign of someone named George. Children who should be sleeping or going to school or literally anything except this scurry past you, clutching tools. Some are as young as 5. At that age today, kids are learning colors. In Victorian England, they're learning how to avoid getting sucked into machinery. Adorable in a tragic way. The closer you get to the factory, the darker the sky becomes. Not because of clouds, but because of smoke. An actual, man-made artificial night. Chimneys belched black fumes like dragons with a sinus infection. And after 2 minutes in this environment, your lungs feel like they're aging in dog years. As you cross a narrow bridge, you look down and see the river, formerly water, now an unidentifiable soup of chemicals, dead fish, and regret. It bubbles. Water should not bubble unless heated. You make a mental note to never fall into it unless you want superpowers or immediate death. And then just when you think it cannot possibly get more miserable, the factory bell rings again. Loud, metallic, and full of disappointment. Your pace quickens. Not because you want to, but because you fear the foreman discovering you're late. The foreman is a man whose personality is 90% anger and 10% hat. By the time you reach the factory gates, your shoes are soaked, your lungs are compromised, your mood is low, and your spirit is gently leaking out of your ears. And this was just the commute. You haven't even started your shift yet. After surviving the Victorian commute, a feat deserving of a national medal, you finally approach the building where your dreams and spinal alignment will go to die, the factory. It rises out of the smog like a brick mountain designed by someone who really hated windows, oxygen, and joy. The structure is huge, imposing, and somehow manages to look both abandoned and overcrowded. At the same time, the first thing you notice is the noise. You don't see the machines yet, but you hear them. A distant metallic roaring that sounds like a thunderstorm being attacked by angry kitchen utensils. It's a chorus of clanks, bangs, whirs, and the occasional scream of a steam pipe releasing pressure in a way that suggests it's also emotionally stressed. Your ears attempt to resign from your body immediately. The factory doors themselves are heavy iron slabs, the kind of doors you'd expect on a medieval dungeon or a high-security prison. You hesitate to touch them because they radiate the unsettling energy of something that has seen things, terrible things, things involving fingers. Once inside, you're hit by a wall of heat, noise, and grime, so thick it practically has its own personality. The interior is dim, lit only by small windows that are somehow simultaneously filthy and cracked beyond recognition. Dust hangs in the air like it's paying rent. Workers move through the haze like ghosts with union problems. The floor is uneven and coated in oil, dirt, metal shavings, and substances you choose not to identify for your own emotional well-being. Every step feels like a gamble, and every gamble feels like a potential lawsuit which does not exist yet. Your first instinct is to turn around and leave, maybe run, maybe relocate to a different century. But no, the foreman has spotted you. He's a man carved entirely out of scowls, stress, and Victorian misery. His job is to glare at workers until they speed up, and he is excellent at it. He gives you a look that says, "If you even think about going home, I will invent new forms of disappointment." You glance at the machinery and immediately regret every decision that brought you to this moment. Looms, gears, belts, presses, all enormous, all loud, all powered by steam and spite. Every machine looks like it's one poorly timed blink away from removing an important part of your body. And the shift hasn't even started. Standing there in the smoke filing to a metallic orchestra of doom, you realize something profound. You do not belong here. Your modern brain whispers, "Nope." Your lungs whisper, "Goodbye," and your heart whispers, "Is it too late to become a baker instead?" But it's too late. Welcome to the factory. You might expect on your first day in a Victorian factory some kind of structured orientation, a friendly supervisor, a pamphlet, a demonstration video starring a cheerful man explaining safety procedures. No, absolutely not. This is the Victorian era. The only safety orientation you're getting is don't stand too close to things that spin fast. Your training begins when a foreman points to a massive machine the size of a carriage and says, "Right, you operate that. That's it." Those 4 words are your syllabus, your handbook, your entire educational framework. You stare at the machine. The machine stares back menacingly, and somewhere deep inside, a little voice whispers, "Life." Victorian machinery is not friendly. It is not labeled. It is not color-coded. It does not have a helpful emergency stop button. It's a tangled mess of gears, belts, pistons, and steam pipes, all screaming for attention, and occasionally spitting hot droplets at you like angry mechanical llamas. Your job is to keep everything running smoothly, which is optimistic, considering you don't even know what half the parts do. Perhaps no one does. A coworker approaches you, an older man, missing 3 fingers, and the majority of his enthusiasm for life. This is your mentor. He shouts over the noise, "Don't let your sleeve get caught," then immediately turns away, because frankly that covers most of the curriculum. You nod politely, as if this single warning will protect you from the 18 other ways the machine plans to injure you. You try to pay attention to the motions of the workers around you, but they move with the speed and precision of people who have long since accepted their fate. They grab, pull, crank, feed, push, twist, all in a sequence so complicated it might as well be a dance performed as a warning to future generations. The foreman walks by again, glaring at you with the intensity of a man who believes inefficiency is a personal insult. He yells, "Faster," even though you haven't yet identified which part of the machine is the work part. You'd love to ask questions, but questions imply curiosity, and curiosity implies you're nuked, and if they know you're nuked, might assign you to a more dangerous station, like feeding raw material into the machine affectionately nicknamed the hand collector. Every second you spend in orientation lowers your life expectancy. Your pulse rises, your palms sweat, your clothing becomes a liability, and your eyes dart around like you're waiting for a trap door to open. In this moment, standing before a monstrous Victorian machine with nothing but anxiety and finger counting as your guide, you realize your real orientation is not try not to die. It's try not to die yet. Now that you've survived orientation, which was essentially someone shouting, "Don't lose a limb," over industrial screaming, it's time to meet your new coworkers, the Victorian machines. These mechanical beasts are enormous, steam-oared, and built with all the empathy of a tax auditor during a famine. Modern machines beep politely, offer guidance, and stop automatically if you sneeze near them. Victorian machines, they operate on a very different philosophy, one that can best be summarized as if it moves, crush it. If it doesn't move, crush it anyway. The first time you reach toward the machine with trembling hands, you notice the collection of warning signs around you, not painted signs. Those didn't exist yet. No, the warnings come in the form of your coworkers missing fingers. One man is short thumb, another is missing 2 fingertips, and the veteran working next to you appears to have lost something so long ago he can't even remember which part. Machines in this era were driven by leather belts, spinning so fast they practically became philosophical concepts. One moment there is a visible belt, the next moment it's a blur, capable of removing your sleeve, dignity, and arm in a single swoop. You try to keep your clothing tucked in, but Victorian fabric has no stretch, no flexibility, and no interest in teamwork. If your shirt catches on something, it's taking you with it. You attempt to focus, feeding raw material into the machine as instructed. The gears grind, the pistons pump, and every clank feels like a personal threat. The entire mechanism shakes the floor in a way that suggests it is held together solely by rust, hope, and passive aggression. Occasionally, someone will shout a warning, like, "Watch your hands," or "Mind the gears," which would be helpful if you weren't already fully committed to keeping every part of yourself intact. The problem is that Victorian machines do not care about your commitment. They sense weakness, they smell fear, and you're producing fear at factory scale. At one point, your sleeve brushes just a little too close to a spinning cog. Time slows. You see your past life flash before your eyes, including memories you didn't even know you had, like that time you cried over dropping a sandwich. You jerk your arm away just in time, and a coworker nods in approval, as if you've passed a very dark rite of passage. You hear that one machine in the corner is nicknamed the Nibbler. You do not ask why. By midday, you understand why Victorian workers never became attached to their fingers. The machines wanted them more. Take a deep breath. Actually, no, don't. Not in a Victorian factory. The air inside this place is not air. It is a hostile substance, a mixture, a cocktail, a Victorian smoothie of dust, soot, steam, oil, vapor, and the faint aroma of everyone else's suffering. From the moment you walk in, your lungs file a complaint. Each inhale feels like you've accidentally consumed a handful of gravel. Each exhale feels like a negotiation between life and poor decisions. Breathing becomes a strategic choice rather than an automatic one. You look around and realize the atmosphere has texture. You can see particles floating. Cotton lint if you work in a textile mill, metal dust if you work with machinery, or coal soot if the factory is powered by a steam engine that looks one spark away from national disaster. These particles swirl through the air, like they're enjoying their freedom at your expense. Within minutes, your throat is dry, your eyes are watering, and your lungs feel like a poorly maintained accordion. Victorian workers called this sensation normal. Modern doctors would call it, "You need to get out of there immediately." But no, your shift is just beginning. Workers around you cough constantly. Not small coughs, the kind of coughs that echo across the factory floor like dying bears. You hear deep, rattling wheezes that sound like someone trying to start an old lawnmower. No one covers their mouth because everyone is too busy clinging to consciousness. And if someone coughs something solid, well, that's between them and the nearest priest. The factory floor is hot, too. Steam powers everything, so the temperature hovers somewhere between uncomfortable sauna and slow-boiling beef stew. You sweat instantly, which would be fine if the sweat didn't immediately combine with soot to create a new element. Victorian paste, a sticky black coating on your skin that never fully washes off. Your lungs grow heavier. The deeper into the factory you walk, the worse it gets. By mid-morning, you're trying to conserve oxygen like a Victorian monk practicing industrial meditation. You've invented 3 new coughing patterns, and you're starting to see shapes in the haze. The machines, the foreman, or perhaps just your will to live, leaving your body in visible form, and there's no escape. The windows are sealed shut because opening them would let the outside air in, and fresh air is a luxury reserved for people not currently sweating on factory floors. By the time you reach midday, you don't need a doctor to diagnose you. You need a time machine. This isn't air. This is the Industrial Revolution's way of telling you to go home. If you thought the air was trying to kill you, wait until you hear the soundtrack of Victorian industrialism. The factory noise is less background ambience and more constant, unrelenting psychological assault. It doesn't simply echo. It occupies space inside your skull like it's paying rent. The moment you step onto the factory floor, the sound hits you like a brick to the face. The machines roar, clank, grind, war, hiss, and bang in a chaotic symphony that would make even heavy metal bands say, "Okay, that's a bit much." It's not just loud. It's aggressive, violent, the kind of noise that doesn't fade into the background, but becomes the background of your nightmares. Your ears immediately begin to protest. They try to fold themselves shut. They attempt to resign. They consider immigrating to a quieter part of your head. But Victorian factories have no quiet parts, only louder parts, and far louder parts. Communication is impossible. If you want to speak to the person next to you, you must scream with the intensity of someone confessing a lifelong secret. Most of the time, they still don't hear you. The machines drown out every sound, including your internal monologue, which is honestly a blessing, because your internal monologue is currently screaming. You'll try at first to protect your hearing. You'll cover your ears. You'll tilt your head. You'll pray. None of it works. The noise goes through you like the factory is trying to communicate directly with your bones. Victorian workers didn't have earplugs. The closest thing to ear protection was stuffing cotton into your ears, which is also what caused half the hearing problems in the first place. As the hours drag on, your brain begins to adapt badly. You start imagining patterns in the clanging, like the machines are sending you threatening Morse code messages. One piston makes a noise that, if you listen long enough, resembles laughter. And that's when you realize the machines aren't just loud. They're mocking you. Your nerves fray. Your shoulders tense. Your sanity loosens. Time becomes irrelevant. Your thoughts blur into one continuous plea for silence. But the machines do not care about your suffering. They are fueled by steam, coal, and spite, and they will keep screaming until the end of your shift or the end of civilization. Victorian workers often went deaf slowly. You're going deaf immediately, and possibly emotionally, too. By the end of hour 1, you don't just want silence, you want revenge. just when you think the machinery is the worst thing in the factory. Something far more demoralizing enters your field of vision: the supervisor. Victorian supervisors were not hired for their communication skills or emotional warmth. No, they were selected for qualities such as chronic unhappiness, the ability to glare through walls, and a voice that could cut through industrial noise and hope simultaneously. Your supervisor materializes out of the steam like an underpaid Victorian ghost. His posture is rigid, his expression is bleak, and his eyebrows seem permanently stuck in the "I'm disappointed in you" position. You don't even know him yet, but somehow you already feel like you owe him money. His clothing is simple: dusty trousers, a waistcoat, boots that have stomped on many dreams. But what truly defines him is his authority aura. This aura radiates stress. Workers straighten up as soon as he walks by, moving with the speed and panic normally reserved for natural disasters. The foreman doesn't smile, he doesn't blink, he just judges. His version of encouragement: faster. His version of constructive feedback: you're doing it wrong. His version of empathy: we don't pay you to think. He approaches you slowly, like a predator who's disappointed he has to chase his meal. You try to act natural, which is difficult because you don't know what natural looks like when surrounded by death machines. Sweat drips down your back, your hands shake. You consider making eye contact, then immediately regret the thought. Eye contact is how he detects fear. When he finally speaks to you, it's not a greeting, it's a warning disguised as a question. Is that the best you can do? Your soul leaves your body briefly. He points at your machine and shouts tips that are not tips. Don't jam it and keep it moving. You nod obediently, even though you have no idea whose fault it is, when the machine suddenly decides it hates productivity and stops for fun. Around you, seasoned workers move with robotic precision, pretending they're not terrified. They've been here long enough to know that the supervisor senses weakness the way sharks sense blood. And in the rare event someone slows down, maybe they're injured, maybe their soul just left for a moment, the supervisor's voice cuts through the factory. Do you want to be replaced? The answer is always yes, but the paycheck says no. You realize in this moment that you could survive the noise, the dust, even the machinery. But the supervisor, he is the true villain of the Industrial Revolution. You might believe, as a modern human with rights and hydration needs, that a lunch break is a moment to rest, regroup, and maybe regain the will to live. In the Victorian factory, however, a lunch break is simply the period during which you continue working while chewing something vaguely edible. The bell rings, signaling this sacred window of nourishment. And by sacred, I mean roughly 8 minutes, give or take how generous the supervisor feels that day. He never feels generous. The machines don't stop. You don't stop. Your existential dread doesn't stop. The only thing that pauses is your hope. Your lunch is whatever you could carry in your pocket without it liquefying: yesterday's bread, now slightly fossilized, a cold, wrinkled potato, or, if you're lucky, a piece of cheese that costs half a week's wages and smells like it legally qualifies as a weapon. You pull it out with trembling hands, blow a fine layer of factory dust off it, and take a bite. Delicious. No, but it contains calories, and that's enough. Victorian workers didn't sit down for meals. Sitting would imply rest, and rest would imply humanity. Instead, everyone stands at their machine, hunched over like goblins, eating their sad lunches, while avoiding moving parts that could easily turn a meal break into a medical emergency. If your bread falls on the floor, you face a moral crisis. Do you pick it up? Do you leave it? Do you cry? Do you accept this as a sign that lunch is over? Most people pick it up. 5-second rule. In the Victorian factory, it's more of a 5-second glance to ensure no rats beat you to it rule. The noise continues so deafening that you can't even hear yourself chewing, which is a blessing because Victorian food does not make pleasing sounds. Your jaw works overtime, trying to break through bread that could double as a construction material. Meanwhile, bits of dust float into your food, adding a gritty crunch that no cookbook could ever justify. Occasionally, someone tries to exchange a small joke or weary smile with a coworker during lunch, but the noise drowns everything out. Laughter is forbidden, not by rules, but by the environment. If you manage to grin, it's mostly because your brain is losing oxygen. Then, just as your stomach begins to understand that food has arrived, the supervisor stomps past and bellows. Breaks over. Your soul collapses. 8 minutes have passed. Your potato is unfinished. Your jaw is tired. Your spirit is tired. And you now have another 10 hours of work ahead of you. Welcome to Victorian lunch. By the time the afternoon rolls around, your energy is gone. Not low, not tired, but entirely missing, like it packed a small suitcase, slipped out the back door, and moved to another country. Your body is now operating solely on instinct, fear, and whatever microscopic nutrients were in that cold potato you inhaled during lunch. The machines do not care. The supervisor does not care. Even time itself seems to be dragging its feet, refusing to move faster because it enjoys watching you suffer. Your arms ache from repetitive motions that haven't changed since sunrise. Your back feels like it's auditioning for a tragedy. Your legs are trembling. Your fingers, they're numb. And numbness is both comforting and terrifying in a workplace where losing a finger is considered a mild inconvenience. This is the part of the day when Victorian workers entered what historians politely call the afternoon slump and what you might call the final collapse. Your eyelids grow heavy. You begin to sway slightly, not because you're dancing, but because gravity is trying to negotiate your surrender. Every minute feels like an hour. Every hour feels like a personal attack. Your brain, starved for stimulation beyond clanking metal, and the foreman's disapproval, begins to drift. You imagine yourself somewhere peaceful, lying in a grassy meadow, sitting by a quiet river, or simply being unconscious in any decade that isn't this one. Then your hand slips. You jolt awake, and you reminded that the machine you reoperating can remove large sections of your body if you daydream too hard. Around you, everyone else is suffering the same collapse. Some workers move on autopilot, their eyes glazed over like overworked Victorian owls. Others are pale from hunger. A few look like they're communicating with spirits out of sheer exhaustion. But no one stops. They can't. The machine keeps moving, so you must keep moving, because stopping means introducing your limbs to industrial-era engineering. Your mind starts asking strange questions. How long have I been here? What even is time? Is this shift ever going to end? You check the clock. You think 3 hours have passed. You're wrong. It's been 7 minutes. Your stomach growls. Your spine compresses. Your soul evaporates. But still, the afternoon refuses to end. All you can do is keep working. Keep breathing lightly. The air is toxic, and hope the bell eventually shows mercy. Spoiler, it won't. Not for many, many hours. At some point in the afternoon, right when your soul has fully left your body, and your muscles are functioning through sheer spite, you notice something horrifying. Nobody reacts when someone gets hurt. Truly, absolutely nobody. A man several stations over catches his hand on a spinning belt. There's a yelp, a blur of motion, and suddenly he's missing a finger. A single finger. Not enough for a break. Not enough for sympathy. Not even enough for paperwork, because paperwork doesn't exist yet, unless it's a bill you can't pay. He wraps what remains of the finger in a rag he probably washed last in the Crimean War, mutters something that is definitely not polite, and simply keeps working. You stand there in shock, clutching your fully attached hand, thinking, surely this warrants a pause. It does not. Victorian workers have 3 reactions to catastrophic injuries: a grunt, an insult directed at the machine, continuing the shift. Meanwhile, you stubbed your toe earlier and nearly filed for early retirement. Another worker gets their hair caught in a gear. The machine snarls. She screams. The foreman yells. Not out of concern, but because lost productivity is the real tragedy here. They cut her hair free, hand her a cap, and she returns to work as if she merely spilled tea. You watch all of this unfold, like you re-witnessing an alternate universe where human pain is merely an annoying scheduling conflict. Burns are even more common. Steam pipes hiss like angry geese, and when they release pressure unexpectedly, they scorch everything within range. Arms, faces, optimism. Workers respond by swearing, shaking their arm, then getting back to feeding the machine, because if you stop, it will absolutely find a way to punish you for your hesitation. Occasionally, someone gets pulled into a machine more seriously. The line stops for a few minutes, not for rescue. No one here is trained for that, but for extraction. During this pause, workers use the break to stretch, wipe, sweat, or take a bite of their bread rock hybrid from lunch. It's the closest thing anyone gets to a moment of peace. And your supervisor. His emotional response ranges from irritated to bored. He's seen too many injuries to care. In fact, he probably uses them as informal teaching moments. That's what happens when you lose focus. Back to work. You suddenly realize the terrifying truth. Injuries aren't accidents here. They're occupational features. Victorian workers build resilience. You build panic. And the shift continues. You've been working for what feels like 14 lifetimes. The machines are still roaring. Your body is held together by sweat and delusion. And your soul has long since wandered off to live a quieter life somewhere in rural France. But then, miraculously, the bell rings. For a brief, transcendent moment, you feel something close to joy. The sound is shrill and metallic, but to your battered Victorian brain, it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Your entire body surges with relief. Your fingers unclench. Your spine uncoils slightly. You smile for the first time since childhood. The shift is over. You did it. You survived. You're free. Or so you foolishly think. Because as you turn to leave, already fantasizing about collapsing face first into your straw mattress, your supervisor appears. His silhouette blocks the doorway like a Victorian eclipse. He clears his throat in the way a man does when he is about to ruin your year. Over time, he announces, not as a suggestion, not as a negotiating point, as a decree. Your smile dies instantly, falling off your face like loose plaster in a condemned building. Overtime is not optional. Overtime is not paid extra. Overtime is simply the universe saying, congratulations, you thought you were done. Adorable. In the Victorian factory system, If the machines are running, you are running. If the machines need more output, you need fewer boundaries. So the bell that moments ago sounded like a celebration now feels like a practical joke. You return to your station with the posture of a medieval peasant being marched to the stocks. Every part of your body is screaming. Your knees wobble. Your wrists feel like they're made of molten candle wax. Your shoulders gone. They belong to history now. They Victorian workers rarely complained. They couldn't afford to. You, however, begin bargaining with the universe. If I survive this, you whisper, I will never complain about Wi-Fi again. A bold promise, considering your survival odds are dropping like the value of Victorian air quality. The overtime drags on and on and on. The light outside fades. The windows darken. Not that they were doing much anyway. Your internal clock breaks. The only rhythm left in your life is the machine's dangerous heartbeat and the supervisor's occasional bellowing. Finally, after hours of extra labor that were definitely not in your imaginary contract, the bell rings for real. This time, no one celebrates. They simply shuffle out, too numb to feel anything. You walk toward the exit, thinking one thing. If this is the best of all possible worlds, linnets and a Victorian factory worker really needed to have a conversation. When your shift finally ends, after enough hours to make time itself feel tired, you stagger out of the factory like a ghost who died from overwork and is now confused about how haunting functions. The air outside should feel refreshing, but this is Victorian England, so it mostly feels like breathable coal. Still, anything is better than the factory. Your legs are jelly. Not smooth, elegant jelly. No, more like the lumpy, suspicious jelly Victorian children dreaded at Christmas. Every step sends shockwaves up your spine. Your feet throb inside your shoes, which by now have absorbed so much sewer water they legally qualify as soup. The street is dark, not nighttime dark, industrial dark. A thick fog rolls in, carrying the smell of burning coal, rotting trash, and someone coughing aggressively 3 streets away. You take a deep breath out of habit and immediately regret it when your lungs threaten to unionize. The walk home should be simple, except nothing in the Victorian era is simple. The cobblestones are slippery, uneven, and seem to rearrange themselves specifically to trip you. You grip your coat around you, though it provides warmth only in the emotional sense. Children, yes, children walk beside you. They also just finished their shifts. Their tiny bodies carry tools bigger than their hopes. A 6-year-old casually passes you, looking fresher than you do, and you feel shame. He's on his way home to help his family with chores after a 14-hour shift. You're barely managing to remain vertical. Rats scurry across your path, bold as ever. One looks you dead in the eye, and you get the sense that it is judging you. It probably had a more productive shift than you did. It certainly looks cleaner. You pass polluted rivers, collapsed wooden fences, overcrowded tenements, and the occasional man yelling at a chimney for personal reasons. Your body aches everywhere. Your arms feel like wet rope. Your throat burns. Your elbows hurt. And you didn't even know elbows could hurt independently. Halfway home, you start fantasizing, not about food or rest. Those are long-term dreams. You fantasize about sitting, just sitting on anything. A stool, a crate, the curb, a damp Victorian cabbage. You would sit on anything. But no, you must keep walking, because if you stop, the cold will set in. And the cold in this era is the kind that tempts you into a lifelong nap. By the time you reach your street, your soul has filed for bankruptcy. You have aged decades. Your shadow looks tired. And this is only day one. Victorians did this every single day. Tomorrow, you will never want to get up again. Unfortunately, you will have to. You finally make it home, or at least to the building where you temporarily store your body between factory shifts. Calling it a home is generous. Calling it structurally sound is optimistic. Calling it livable is downright fictional. What you actually return to is a cramped tenement room where privacy, comfort, and breathable air have all been removed for efficiency. The moment you step inside, you're struck by the smell. It's a complex blend of damp clothing, cold soot, boiled cabbage, and the faint but persistent scent of too many humans sharing not enough space. If you bottled it, you'd have a fragrance named despair. Number 5. Your room is small. So small that if you stretch out your arms, you might accidentally become part of someone else's family. Your bed is a pile of straw that crunches ominously, like it's storing secrets. Half of it is permanently flattened from generations of exhausted workers collapsing onto it. The other half has an unsettling lump that you hope is straw, but suspect is something historical. You share this room with several other people, siblings, parents, cousins, or complete strangers who wandered in at some point and never left. Space is a suggestion, not a reality. Everyone gets about 1 square foot of personal area, which Victorian society considered luxurious because technically it is more than you have in the factory. Conversation is impossible, not because of noise, but because everyone is too tired to produce language. Instead, the room is filled with quiet groans, occasional coughing fits, and the soft scratching sound of a rat family in the corner, who also pay rent by virtue of simply refusing to leave. You try to wash up, but the communal basin contains water that looks like it has already retired from cleanliness. Still, you splash your face with it, hoping it will revive you. It does not. It simply makes you wet and disappointed. Dinner is whatever you can afford, which is usually bread, thin soup, or something boiled so long it no longer remembers its original identity. You eat mechanically, staring into the middle distance like a person emotionally rebooting. As night falls, the room becomes colder. You huddle under a thin blanket that has the insulating power of a damp napkin. Someone snores, someone coughs, someone mutters in their sleep about the foreman. You wonder how long your body can endure this schedule before it simply refuses. And as you lie there staring at the cracked ceiling, one thought drifts through your exhausted mind. If this is home, what exactly was hell supposed to look like? So, here you are, lying on your lumpy straw mattress, your spine negotiating surrender terms, your lungs filled with enough factory dust to qualify as a new mineral deposit. You've survived your first Victorian workday. If we stretch the definition of survived to include still technically breathing, but spiritually deceased. Now, it's time to answer the question, could you survive as a Victorian factory worker? Let's review. You woke up to a bell that sounded like it hated you personally. You walked through a neighborhood where every puddle was a biological hazard. You operated machines designed during an era when safety regulations were considered witchcraft. You inhaled air with the nutritional value of chimney soot. You ate lunch while actively trying to not get devoured by moving parts. You endured a supervisor whose hobbies included glaring and emotional damage. You worked overtime you didn't agree to paid for or mentally survive. you caked home through a landscape that looked like the Industrial Revolution was losing an argument with gravity. You slept in a room so overcrowded it might legally qualify as a jar of human sardines, and tomorrow you get to do it all again. Victorian factory workers weren't just tough. They were forged from suffering and necessity. Their bodies adapted to the noise, the filth, the hunger, the danger, and the complete absence of things like minimum wage, weekends, or basic human rights. They didn't thrive, they endured. Endurance was the only metric available. Modern humans, by comparison, can barely tolerate slow Wi-Fi, lukewarm coffee, or phone batteries dipping below 20%. Imagine telling a Victorian worker that people today complain when their office chairs don't have lumbar support. They would stare at you, stare at the chair, and then politely ask what support means. Let's be brutally honest, your lungs gone by noon, your hearing eaten by machines in under an hour, your fingers, the machines want them more than you do, your mental health, it evaporated at exactly 3:17 p.m. Your will to continue left your body sometime between overtime announcement and the third coughing fit. You would not survive a day as a Victorian factory worker, and that's not an insult. It's a testament to how unbelievably hard their lives were, and how unimaginable that level of endurance is to us now. They didn't have a choice. You do. And you chose to watch this video from a warm room on a comfortable device while sitting on a chair that probably does have lumbar support. Congratulations. You already live better than a Victorian factory worker on their best day. Before the scandal, before the Senate's shaking fear, before Rome itself began trembling at the sound of drums in the dark, the Bacchanalia were gentle things. They were whispered gatherings held at twilight among vineyards where the air smelled of crushed grapes and warm earth. These early rites came from the Greeks, passed quietly into Italy through the cult of Dionysus, later reshaped into the Roman Bacchus, and in those first years the participants were mostly women, wives, widows, daughters, seeking what the rigid Roman world could not give them: permission to feel something wild within themselves. Imagine it, a hillside outside the city, lanterns flickering in niches carved into the stone, laurel leaves rustling, a circle of women dressed not in the heavy fabrics of formal Rome, but in loosened garments that allowed movement, breath, and escape. At the center stands a simple wooden altar decorated with ivy, grapes, and a clay cup filled with the first pour of the year's wine. There is no frenzy yet, no ecstatic shrieking, no chaotic chorus, only soft singing, rhythmic steps, and a shared promise to honor Bacchus by stepping outside the boundaries carved by husbands, fathers, and lawgivers. For these women, the wine was never just wine. It was a key, a loosening of the social knots tied so tightly around them since birth. The Bacchanalia were supposed to be moments of relief, of rebirth, of communion with a God who insisted that joy was not a sin but a divine necessity. And because the rites were private, held far from the city, they became even more sacred. No men were permitted in the earliest phases. The secrecy wasn't sinister then. It was simply protection. But secrecy in Rome always breeds suspicion. These twilight rituals took root because they answered a human need. Rome rarely acknowledged the desire to be unbound, to step away from duty and discipline and into something softer, stranger, and more ancient than the empire's marble columns. When the wine began to flow, and the songs drew the women into deeper rhythms, something within them stirred. A sense of union with Bacchus himself, not as a god of drunken disorder, as later stories claimed, but as a liberator, a whisperer, a reminder that beneath the Roman facade, every soul still longed for the wilderness. And from this quiet beginning, an unstoppable movement was born. As the Bacchanalia grew, so did their magnetism. What began as a sanctuary for women slowly expanded into something far more electrifying, an invitation to anyone who felt the weight of Roman expectation pressing against their ribs. Young men curious about forbidden rites, enslaved people yearning for a taste of equality, freed men rejected by patrician circles, and even a few adventurous nobles slipped into the gatherings. The rites were no longer quiet twilight ceremonies. They became vibrant, thrumming nights where wine loosened limbs, drums shattered restraint, and every social boundary Rome held sacred blurred into mist. To understand the appeal, you must picture Rome not as a city of marble, but as a pressure cooker. Public life demanded discipline. Family life demanded obedience. Religion demanded rigidity. But the Bacchanalia demanded only surrender. Participants believed that bakers could speak through ecstasy, through the trembling abandon that arrived when wine and rhythm combined. Those who attended said the god was not prayed to, he was felt. Entering a rite meant stepping into a world where the divine pressed close, tasted on the tongue with every swallow of wine. The rituals intensified. Torches were carried into forest clearings, vines wrapped around tree trunks like living serpents. The worshippers danced in spirals, their movements increasingly unrestrained as the night deepened. Some claimed they felt their souls leaving their bodies in brief flashes, joining back us in a realm where mortal rules dissolved. Others described visions of vines bursting from the earth, of hooved creatures dancing beside them, of the god's shadow slipping between torchlight and darkness. And woven through it all was a dangerous, intoxicating idea that the Bacchanalia allowed participants to become more than they were. Slaves forgot their chains. Women forgot their duties. Men forgot the rigid expectations of Roman masculinity. In those nights, they were not defined by birth, wealth, or citizenship. They were simply humans in communion with a god who celebrated the pleasures Rome pretended to fear. Of course, not everyone approved. Neighbors heard drumming long after midnight. Strangers whispered about strange convulsions and cries they could not interpret. Rumors swirled, some harmless, some lurid. But what truly frightened the traditionalists was the growing belief that the Bacchanalia offered liberation. Rome itself could not provide, and the more people tasted that freedom, the more they returned. The rites were no longer just ceremonies. They were escape, rebellion, revelation, a doorway into a world Rome did not control, and therefore a world Rome would soon seek to destroy. To the uninitiated, a Bacchanalia appeared nothing short of madness. But madness in these rites was a language, a deliberate unraveling meant to draw worshippers deeper into the presence of Bacchus. The transformation began with masks. Worshippers donned faces of sawdust, thorns, wild beasts, and exaggerated human expressions, smiling mouths stretched to wide, eyes frozen in ecstatic delight. The mask freed them. Once hidden behind painted terracotta or carved wood, they could shed the identity Rome forced upon them, and step into a creature of the wilderness, a being ruled not by logic, but by instinct. Music guided the descent. Flutes pierced the night with restless melodies. Drums throbbed like a second heartbeat, and cymbals clashed in erratic bursts meant to jolt the senses awake. No orderly Roman procession marched to such music. This was sound designed to dissolve the boundary between self and spirit. Participants said, "You didn't hear it, you entered it." The rhythm swallowed thought, replacing it with something primal that demanded movement. And so they moved. Spirals, leaps, trembling motions, collapsing and rising again in waves, each dancer feeding off the frenzy of the next. Wine, of course, flowed without measure, but it was never just a drink. It was a sacrament. Each cup symbolized a step closer to communion with Bacchus, a loosening of the mind so the god could slip into the cracks. The Romans believed inspiration. Fura was divine possession. In the Bacchanalia, that possession became the purpose. Worshippers sought the moment when they no longer danced but were danced, when they no longer sang but were sung through. For a few breaths, they ceased to be alone in their bodies. Something shared, something ancient passed through them. Animals were sometimes present, goats crowned with ivy, or small creatures released into the frenzy as living symbols of Baku's domain. Torches cast wild shadows onto trees, turning the forest into a stage where reality looked thin and unreliable. And as the rites reached their peak, some participants claimed to feel claws, hooves, or vines brushing against them. Hallucinations, perhaps, or the mind's attempt to make sense of overwhelming sensory overload. To Rome's conservative eyes, this was chaos. But inside the circle, it felt like truth. The masks allowed honesty without consequence. The music rewrote the boundaries of the self. The wine opened a gate. And when all these elements converged, worshippers believed they touched not insanity, but liberation. A freedom Rome could neither grant nor take away, and that freedom terrified the powerful. As the Bacchanalia expanded, so did the rumors surrounding them. The rites were no longer described as simple worship or emotional release. They became, in Rome's imagination, a boiling cauldron of forbidden desires. And, to be fair, the line between spiritual ecstasy and physical ecstasy did blur during these ceremonies. This was not accidental. Bacchus was a god of dualities, creation and destruction, joy and madness, chastity and abandon. To worship him was to navigate the liminal space between the sacred and the sensual. Within the circle of worshippers, bodies moved freely, unrestrained by the usual Roman decorum. Participants danced close, hands brushing, breath mingling, limbs weaving into one another, as though the entire group shared a single pulse. In that intimate darkness, shaped by wine, music, and the belief in divine presence, ordinary boundaries seemed to dissolve. Rome prized control, restraint, and hierarchy. The Bacchanalia erased them. A slave could place a hand on a nobleman's shoulder without fear. A woman could reject her marital silence and sing, shout, or embrace whomever she wished. For participants, this was not scandal, but liberation. To outsiders, however, it was something far more dangerous. Stories circulated of orastic frenzy, of participants losing themselves so completely that they did not remember whom they touched or kissed until dawn. Some accounts claimed men and women lay together in heaps beneath the trees, guided not by desire alone, but by shared possession, driven by the god moving through them. Whether these tales were truth, exaggeration, or political slander is impossible to know. What matters is that the Roman elite believed them. That belief transformed the Bacchanalia from a private cult into a perceived threat. A society built on discipline could not understand a ritual built on surrender. A society obsessed with hierarchy could not tolerate a rite where all were equal in frenzy, and a society terrified of disorder could not abide a festival where worship resembled wild passion under the eyes of a foreign god. Yet for the worshippers themselves, the sensual elements were not sinful or shameful. They were expressions of connection between humans, nature, and the divine. They believed Baku's dissolved loneliness. They believed he fused his followers into a single ecstatic body. And in a world that rigidly separated individuals by class, gender, and duty, that sense of unity felt like a miracle. This merging, this dangerous intimacy, was the spark that would draw the full attention of the Roman Senate. As the Benalia swelled in number and intensity, the rites no longer fit neatly into forest clearings or vineyard edges. Some gatherings moved underground, literally. Worshippers met in secluded grotto, abandoned stewrooms, or chambers carved into hillsides where the echo of chanting wrapped around the stone like a living presence. These hidden spaces amplified the atmosphere. Close air thick with incense, flickering torchlight casting monstrous shadows, masks staring from the darkness like spirits caught between worlds. Secrecy became not just a feature of the cult, but its lifeblood. The secrecy wasn't born of guilt. It was born of protection. Rome frowned on gatherings it couldn't supervise, especially ones where people of all classes mingled as equals. To safeguard their rights, Bacchic followers adopted oaths of silence. New initiates swore never to reveal what happened within the circle once the torches were lit. Breaking that vow meant exile from the group, or worse, divine punishment. Some initiates claimed that Bacchus himself shadowed the meetings, watching from the corners of the chamber, ensuring loyalty through a presence felt but unseen. Initiation ceremonies were elaborate. A newcomer entered blindfolded, guided by the hands of those already within the cult. Their first steps into the chamber symbolized leaving the rigid Roman world behind. They were offered a cup of wine, effectively a pledge of trust, and led to touch sacred objects, vines, animal skins, ceremonial daggers, wooden masks, blessed with oils. Each object represented a facet of Baku's life: wilderness, transformation, and release. Only after this tactile journey did the blindfold come off, revealing the circle of worshippers waiting, masked and silent, ready to welcome the initiate into their ecstatic fold. This growing network of secret locations and vows created something Rome feared far more than indulgence: unity. A unified group acting outside state oversight was dangerous, regardless of its purpose, and the Bacchic rites had become a haven, not just for pleasure seekers, but for those dissatisfied with Roman authority. Enslaved people dreaming of freedom, wives trapped in loveless households, outcasts searching for belonging. The chambers offered anonymity, equality, and the intoxicating feeling of stepping outside Rome's iron grip. But the deeper the secrecy, the more vivid the rumors became. Whispers of conspiracies, dark magic, poisonings, and even political plots began to circulate. None of it was proven, much of it was slander. But perception mattered more than truth, and soon Rome's perception turned deadly. By the early 2nd century BCE, the Bacchanalia had grown far beyond the quiet cult Rome once tolerated. Reports, most exaggerated, some outright invented, reached the Senate describing scenes of chaos, seduction, night-long frenzies, and secret gatherings numbering in the thousands. In a society obsessed with control, nothing was more terrifying than what it could not monitor. And so Rome did what it always did. When confronted with something that defied its rigid order, it panicked. The turning point came when a former initiate, driven by fear or ambition, approached the authorities with a tale that ignited wildfire. He claimed the Bacchanalia were no longer mere rites, but breeding grounds for treason, murder, and moral corruption. He insisted that worshippers forged alliances behind closed doors, plotted against families, exchanged illicit vows, and even committed crimes under the veil of divine frenzy. Whether he believed his own accusations remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Senate seized upon them with desperate enthusiasm. This was not truly about immorality. It was about power. The Bacchanalia had become a parallel society, one where senators held no sway, where women possessed unprecedented influence, where slaves mingled freely with freeborn men, and where individuals acted without deference to Rome's hierarchy, that terrified the ruling class far more than rumors of drunken rites. A cult that ignored social boundaries threatened the very architecture of Roman authority. And so the Senate turned the situation into a full moral crisis. They portrayed the Bacchanalia as a contagion infecting the city, a plague of hysteria that endangered families, virtue, and even the stability of the state. The rhetoric grew increasingly dramatic. Claims of human sacrifice, coerced initiation, mass orgies, forged wills, and poisonings. Libby, writing, later exaggerated it further into a tale of absolute depravity, likely more propaganda than history, but propaganda works best when the public is already afraid. Parents began forbidding their children from leaving home at night. Husbands accused wives of secret participation. Rumors spread through markets and baths, each story more lurid than the last. People whispered that Bacchus himself was rising against Rome, corrupting minds with wine and frenzy. For the Senate, this fear was useful. It allowed them to tighten control, assert moral authority, and justify extreme action. The Bacchanalia were no longer viewed as religious rites, but as an existential threat to Roman civilization itself. And once Rome named something a threat, destruction becomes inevitable. In 186 BCE, fear finally crystallized into violence. The Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, one of the harshest religious crackdowns in Roman history. It declared the Bacchanalia illegal unless explicitly approved by the state, which was essentially never granted. Overnight, a festival once devoted to joy, ecstasy, and divine communion was transformed by decree into a crime. Rome, the great appropriator of foreign gods, had found one it refused to absorb. The crackdown unfolded with brutal efficiency. Magistrates stormed grotto, vineyards, and private homes rumored to house back altars. Torches illuminated scenes of chaos, masks torn from walls, sacred vines ripped from ceilings, ceremonial drums trampled under soldiers' boots. Worshippers who had gathered peacefully were seized in chains, dragged into the streets as examples of Rome's restored order. Some begged, some resisted. Others remained eerily calm, still under the fading spell of Bacchus, whispering prayers as soldiers hauled them away. The Senate framed this purge as a purification, a cleansing of moral pollution. But to those inside the cult, it was nothing short of religious persecution. Trials were swift and often symbolic. Thousands were investigated. Many were executed. Some hanged, some thrown from cliffs, others publicly displayed to warn any who dared to revive the rites. Women, once the heart of Bac worship, suffered especially harsh judgment. The state accused them of seducing men into treason, corrupting households, and spreading disorder, beneath Rome's foundations. Their supposed moral weakness became Rome's convenient justification for oppression. Not all followers submitted. Many resisted in small, defiant ways, hiding masks beneath floorboards, burying wine cups marked with ivy, memorizing hymns so no physical evidence remained. Some fled into the countryside, worshipping in secret, hoping the god would protect them. Others smuggled sacred objects to distant regions where Roman scrutiny was weaker. These pockets of survival kept the big spirit alive, even as Rome proclaimed it extinguished. The Senate's victory was incomplete, and that frustrated them. They could destroy altars, but not memory. They could punish bodies, but not faith. Still, for a time Rome appeared to re-establish control. The official narrative declared order restored, corruption cleansed, danger eliminated. But beneath that triumphant veneer, something far more complex simmered. A wounded population mourning the loss of a god who had offered them freedom. Rome had won militarily, but spiritually, emotionally, the battle had only begun, and in the shadows, Bacchus waited. Despite Rome's aggressive campaign to erase the Bacchanalia, the cult did not disappear. It adapted. Suppression only sharpened its instincts for secrecy. What had once been vibrant festivals with music and torches now transformed into whispered rituals, practiced by scattered pockets of believers who refused to abandon the God who had given them liberation. The Senate could outlaw gatherings, destroy altars, and execute leaders, but it could not kill longing, and longing is where Bacchus lived strongest. Survivors carried what they could of the old rites into hidden corners of their lives. A vine symbol carved inside a ring, a scrap of ivy tucked into a tunic, a quiet toast made at dusk, head bowed, whispering a prayer that once would have been shouted under the moon. Women, especially, kept the cult alive within families. Some taught their daughters hymns, disguised as labbas. Others held private rites inside closed rooms, using a single cup of wine and a handful of grapes in place of the ecstatic feasts of earlier days. The music was gone, the frenzy absent, but the devotion remained intact, compressed, not broken. Outside the city, the cult found more fertile ground. In the countryside, where Rome's surveillance waned and villagers clung to older gods, Bacchus was welcomed back with little hesitation. Traveling merchants carried stories of persecution that transformed Bacchus into a kind of outlaw deity, one who understood suffering, resistance, and the hunger for freedom. This new interpretation only strengthened the bond between God and follower. Bacchus was no longer just the patron of wine. He became a symbol of rebellion, a spiritual refuge for anyone living under the boot of Roman authority. Meanwhile, in Greece and southern Italy, where Dionysian worship predated Rome itself, the crackdown was largely ignored. Local communities continued their rites with minor adjustments to avoid provoking Roman officials. Over time, these surviving traditions blended with the remnants of the original Bacchanalia. What emerged was a more restrained but enduring form of devotion, one that emphasized theater, procession, and symbolic ecstasy rather than frenzied possession. The spirit of the cult remained alive, even if the volume had been turned down. The Senate had expected obedience, not endurance. The continued survival of back worship proved something Rome was always reluctant to admit. People need spaces where the rigid boundaries of society soften, where joy is not a luxury but a right, and where the divine is not distant but intimate. And as long as humans needed that, Bacchus would never truly vanish. In the centuries that followed the crackdown, Rome changed, but Bacchus remained. Not always in his old, wild form, of course. Time softened him, reshaped him, and dressed him in new rituals, new names, new expressions. But the core of the cult, the desire for liberation, ecstasy, and union with a force greater than oneself, drifted into every corner of Mediterranean culture. The Bacchanalia may have been outlawed, but their spirits slipped through the cracks of civilization like wine seeping into the grain of a wooden cup. As Rome expanded, it absorbed countless traditions, and ironically, even the suppressed Bic rites evolved into socially acceptable festivals. Public spectacles like the Liberalia and dramatic performances rooted in Dionysian theater kept fragments of the old worship alive. Actors wearing masks, once tools of Bacchic immersion, now trod the wooden stages of Roman theaters, invoking the same primal emotions under the guise of art rather than religion. The ecstatic frenzy of the old rites transformed into choreographed dances, ritual songs, and poetic celebrations of the vine. The state had tamed Bacchus, but could not erase him. Even in early Christianity's rise, echoes of Dionysian symbolism persisted. Wine remained a sacred element. Ritual communion, drinking to experience divine presence, mirrored the spiritual logic of the Bacchanalia far more than Rome's senators would ever admit. The idea that the divine could enter the human body through ritual consumption was not new. The Bac worshippers had practiced it centuries before. While the Church rejected the chaos associated with Bacchus, it inherited something deeper: the belief that spiritual transformation could be intimate, emotional, and embodied. In medieval Europe, the figure of Bacchus survived in art, poetry, and folklore. Painters revived him as a symbol of pleasure, rebellion, and the human craving for release from constraint. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering ancient texts, recast him as a complex deity, not merely the god of drunken excess, but a force of creativity, inspiration, and liberation. Writers described him as the divine spark that dissolves fear, awakens passion, and reveals truths hidden by everyday life. Today, the name Bacchanalia has become shorthand for unrestrained celebration. But beneath the caricature lies a profound truth. The ancient worshippers were seeking more than wine or frenzy. They were seeking freedom, the right to feel deeply, to break free from imposed identities, to touch the divine without intermediaries. Rome silenced the drums, broke the altars, scattered the worshippers. But the longing that created the Bacchanalia never died, and in that longing, Baccha still lives. To step into an ancient Greek symposium was to cross an invisible border, one separating the ordinary world from a ritualized realm of wine, wit, and carefully curated chaos. The room itself, the andron, was designed for transformation. It was usually the most prestigious chamber in the house, built with a raised threshold to emphasize that this was no casual gathering place. Once you crossed it, you were no longer just a citizen, a friend, or a guest. You became part of a performance, a participant in a cultural engine that shaped politics, philosophy, and reputation. The space was intimate and symmetrical, with couches arranged along the walls so that every man reclined facing the center. This arrangement wasn't aesthetic, it was ideological. No one sat at the head of the room, no one towered above another. Reclining placed each man in a posture of relaxed vulnerability, equal before the cup and equal before the conversation. The floor was often decorated with mosaics, dolphins, vines, sodas, or spiraling geometric patterns meant to echo the swirling motion of wine mixing with water. Even the decoration whispered reminders of Dionysus, the god, presiding quietly over all that would unfold. A servant, usually a young enslaved attendant, would move gracefully between guests, offering water for washing hands and garlands to crown their heads. These garlands, made of ivy or roses, were not mere ornamentation. They symbolized the softening of the mind, the reopening of emotion, the loosening of social tension. The symposium was not a place for stiff formality. It was a place where thoughts were expected to wander, where minds were permitted to bloom like flowers awakened by night air. At the center of everything stood the crater, the great mixing bowl. No one drank unmixed wine. To do so was considered barbaric, a surrender to madness rather than philosophy. Instead, wine and water mingled in proportions chosen by the symposia, the evening's appointed master. His decision shaped the night, a weaker mix for thoughtful conversation, a stronger one for playful banter or emotional vulnerability. His role was not far from that of a conductor guiding a symphony, except this orchestra played with words, glances, debates, and laughter. Behind closed doors, the symposium became a stage where reputations were forged, alliances strengthened, and ideas born. What began as drinking transformed into philosophy, politics, and poetry, braided together into one long, glittering evening. If the symposium was a world unto itself, then the crater, the great mixing bowl, was its beating heart. Everything began there. The Greeks believed pure wine was dangerous, a liquid capable of unraveling the mind and stripping away human reason. Only barbarians drank it unmixed, they claimed. Civilized men diluted theirs with water, practicing a ritual of balance that blended pleasure with restraint. In this simple act of mixing, they expressed a philosophy. Too little wine, and the mind remained stiff. Too much, and it dissolved into ruin. The perfect ratio created clarity, inspiration, and the sweet elasticity of thought. The master of the night, the symposia, determined that ratio. Sometimes he chose a gentle mixture, 3 parts water to 1 part wine. 4 evenings meant to nurture slow conversation or political discussion. Other nights demanded boldness, a stronger mix, maybe 2 to 1, heightening emotional honesty, sharpening humor, even encouraging friendly rivalry. The symposia's judgment shaped the night's entire mood. A heavy-handed host could send the room spiraling into chaos. A wise one guided it toward harmony. Once mixed, the wine traveled from crater to cup through a choreography performed by attendants. Theonicus, often a young servant, poured the diluted wine into elegant silver or terracotta cups, known as kikes. These cups were intentionally shallow and wide, so each sip required a deliberate tilt of the wrist, reminding participants to drink intentionally rather than mindlessly. Many kylics hid small paintings at the bottom, often playful or erotic scenes revealed only when the wine thinned, sparking laughter or commentary. Even drinking vessels became part of the entertainment. But moderation was not just about physical control. It was moral and intellectual. The Greeks believed the best conversations emerged when the mind floated just above sobriety, loosened but not lost. Ideas needed warmth, not wildfire. In this delicate state, poets recited verses with sharp grace. Philosophers posed questions that danced between logic and metaphor. Friends confessed secrets, debated virtues, or challenged each other with riddles. The right wine ratio opened doors inside the mind that could not be opened in daylight. The act of mixing, therefore, became a ritual of self-mastery. It affirmed that the symposium was not a drunken revel, but a disciplined engagement with pleasure. It encoded the Greek belief that wisdom thrives between extremes, between dryness and drunkenness, silence and song, restraint and release. In the crater's swirling currents, Greeks found the perfect metaphor for their culture, refined, deliberate, and always seeking balance. The symposium did not begin with drinking. It began with positioning. Reclining on cushioned couches wasn't laziness. It was a ritualized posture of equality and openness. Lying on the left elbow, feet stretched out toward the wall, guests formed a loose ring around the room. This posture softened the rigid lines of everyday Greek life. Standing meant authority. Sitting meant business. But reclining meant you were ready to think, feel, speak, and listen without the weight of formality pressing into your spine. It signaled that the evening would unfold, not as a hierarchy, but as a shared experience. Once settled, each participant received a garland of flowers or ivy. The wreath served as a symbolic nod to Dionysus, the divine patron of both wine and inspiration. Guests might anoint themselves with perfumed oils, myrrh, cinnamon, or rose, to set the tone for an evening meant to elevate the senses. In this environment, the mind was primed for transformation long before the first cup touched the lips. Conversation began with warm-up dialogue, often playful and light. Men teased one another, recounted small adventures, or commented on the day's events. But as wine slowly entered the bloodstream, talk deepened. The symposium was a theater of intellect, and conversation was its central performance. A good guest brought clever remarks, stories, questions, and a willingness to engage without hostility. Insults were allowed, but artful ones. Wit was prized. Vulgarity was scorned. The entire evening was a balancing act between seriousness and humor, logic and emotion. Philosophical discussion thrived here more than anywhere else in Greek society. Politics, poetry, virtue, justice, beauty. Nothing was too lofty or too delicate for the symposium's smoky air. The room became an arena where ideas clashed and merged like waves in a harbor. Men challenged each other not to assert dominance, but to demonstrate agility of thought. A well-timed argument could inspire admiration. A clumsy one invited ridicule. Yet even ridicule was woven into the ritual, offered in good humor rather than cruelty. Music accompanied the flow of words. A lyre passed from hand to hand. Someone hummed a verse of Homer, someone else improvised a poem on the spot. The boundaries between performance and conversation blurred until the evening felt less like a discussion and more like a dance, each voice stepping rhythmically into the next, reclining, conversing, singing, debating. These were not casual amusements. They were the building blocks of Greek identity, teaching men how to think together, laugh together, and explore the world through shared imagination. No symposium was complete without games, and none was more beloved or more ridiculous than Kotbos. To the uninitiated, it looked like drunken aimlessness, men flicking drags of wine across the room with dramatic flourishes. But to those inside the symposium culture, Kotbos was a test of precision, poise, and charm. It transformed the final drops of a cup into a weapon of competition, turning leisure into art. The game worked like this. Once a guest finished most of his wine, he swirled the remaining dregs in the bottom of his cup. Then, reclining sideways, he would flick his wrist in a smooth arc, sending the last drops flying toward a target. Often a small bronze disc, balanced to top a pole or a basin designed to ring like a bell when hit. The goal wasn't brute force, it was elegance. A proper throw required control, grace, and timing, especially since the player was half reclined and usually halfway drunk. A successful strike sent the disc clattering to the floor, to the cheerful applause or jealous groans of the onlookers. But K-Taboos was more than a game. It was a ritual of flirtation and theatricality. Every throw was dedicated to someone, a lover, a crush, a hopeful conquest. The player would name their chosen beloved, sometimes loudly, sometimes with shy humor, and if he hit the target, it was interpreted as a good omen for that romance. In this way, the symposium became a small stage where desire was performed publicly, but safely. A man could confess affection under the guise of competition, letting the gods of chance and wine judge his fate. The room filled with laughter as men exaggerated their techniques, claiming divine inspiration or blaming Dionysus when their aim faltered. Bets were placed, bragging rights were earned. Some guests elevated K-Taboos into near-athletic ritual, insisting they practiced sober throws at home to improve their symposium performances. Others treated it as an opportunity for comic display, intentionally overacting their failures for entertainment. The game could break tension, spark rivalry, or ignite conversation. Exactly what a good symposium was designed to do. Even the losers gained something: attention. In a culture where wit and charm mattered as much as physical skill, a clever excuse or dramatic failure could be more memorable than a perfect throw. The game rewarded personality as much as precision. K-Taboos turned the symposium into an arena of playful competition, binding guests through joy, mischief, and the shared absurdity of trying to impress one another with a flying drop of wine. It was philosophy's counterpart, the lighter half of the Greek spirit, where intellect paused just long enough to, if wine was the fuel of a symposium, then music and poetry were its soul. Once conversation had warmed the room and laughter had loosened the atmosphere, someone would inevitably reach for a lyre. The soft plucking of strings signaled a shift from debate and games to performance and reflection. Music was not background noise. It was an essential ingredient in transforming ordinary men into thinkers, dreamers, and storytellers. A symposium without music was like watered wine without the wine, technically functional, but spiritually empty. The lyre passed from hand to hand, each guest adding his own flavor. Some played simple melodies, others surprised the group with unexpected skill, revealing talents rarely shown in public life. The Greeks believed music could shape the soul, adjusting emotional states, just as wine adjusted intellectual ones. A gentle tune could soothe heated arguments. A lively rhythm could reignite energy. A melancholy melody could open the floodgates to confessions and deep personal truths. Music guided the emotional current of the night as surely as the symposia guided the wine. Poetry was equally central. Men recited passages from Homer or Hesiod, reminding themselves of heroic ideals and ancient legends. Others delivered sophistic, clever, playful poems crafted to amuse or provoke thought. Some improvised entirely, weaving new stories on the spot, testing their creativity under the gaze of peers. Improvised poetry, especially, was a respected skill. A man who could drink, think, and compose simultaneously earned admiration. The Greeks saw this ability as a gift from the Muses, a spark of divine favor ignited by wine and social harmony. But poetry did more than entertain, it bound the group together. Each recitation invited response, critique, laughter, applause, or counterpoem. Ideas passed from one voice to another, like torches in a relay. Themes emerged: love, bravery, death, beauty, betrayal, virtue. Guests explored them with both sincerity and humor, slipping seamlessly between seriousness and play, laugh. This duality reflected the Greek worldview. Life was tragic and comedic, noble and ridiculous all at once. The symposium mirrored this balance perfectly. Sometimes performances turned intimate. A guest might recite a poem dedicated to a lover in the room, disguising affection beneath metaphor. Another might offer a lament for a lost friend. These moments gave depth to an evening otherwise filled with banter and games, reminding participants that wine was not only for laughter, but also for memory and mourning. Music and poetry transformed the symposium from a drinking party into a shared emotional landscape, one where inspiration could strike at any moment, and where every guest played a part in shaping the night's unfolding story. As the night deepened and the wine settled into that perfect middle ground between clarity and haze, the symposium shifted into its most famous role, a crucible for ideas. This was the hour when conversations sharpened, when laughter thinned into thoughtful silence, and when the air thickened with the weight of questions that had no simple answers. Politics and philosophy were not dry subjects here. They were living creatures, wrestled with, teased, provoked, and sometimes serenaded into revealing their secrets. Politics entered the room first, usually through a casual remark, a complaint about a magistrate, a rumor about a military campaign, or a sly comment about a rival city-state. What began as gossip quickly expanded into the broader world. Athenian democracy, Spartan discipline, Persian ambition, Corinthian trade. All these topics swirled into the conversation. Guests dissected policies, debated leaders, and critiqued decisions with the boldness that only wine could inspire. The symposium was a political classroom without consequences, a place where ideas could be tested without fear of public backlash. Then came philosophy, sweeping into the room like a cold breeze from Mount Olympus. Someone posed a question, not a simple one, but the kind that pressed against the boundaries of human understanding. What is virtue? Is courage a matter of action or intention? Does the soul exist? And if so, where does it reside? What makes a life worth living? The guests leaned in, eyes glinting with curiosity. The symposium was the birthplace of countless philosophical pathways, some playful, some profound, some destined to echo through history. This was the world that gave us Socrates reclining on a couch, challenging his companions with relentless logic. It was the world where Plato, years later, would stage entire dialogues. The symposium turned thought into theater. Every man an actor, every argument a scene, every insight a plot twist. Participants disagreed fiercely, but rarely maliciously. A clever rebuttal drew applause. A flawed argument invited teasing. Truth-seeking was a shared performance, not a solitary pursuit. The beauty of symposium philosophy was its freedom. There were no rigid schools yet, no textbooks, no formal examinations. Thought unfolded naturally, shaped by wine, friendship, and the slow-burning fire of curiosity. The Andron became a miniature universe where the laws of the city loosened and the laws of reason tightened. By the time voices grew soft and eyelids heavy, men often left the symposium changed. Not just entertained, not just relaxed, but stretched, mentally widened by the ideas exchanged in the glow of torchlight and silver cups. Wisdom in Greece wasn't born in temples or courts. It was born in rooms like these. Though symposia were officially gatherings for elite men, the reality was far more nuanced and far more interesting. Into this world of wine, poetry, and philosophical combat stepped women known not for domestic roles, but for intellect, wit, and artistic skill, the hit. These courtesans were nothing like the wives confined to the private quarters of the household. They were educated, charismatic, and often sharper in conversation than the men reclining beside them. Their presence shifted the social chemistry of the symposium entirely, adding layers of intrigue, inspiration, and tension to the night. A hitra could read poetry, play the lyre, challenge arguments, and offer commentary bold enough to make even seasoned thinkers pause. Unlike respectable women, she moved freely in male intellectual circles, navigating complex conversations with grace and strategy. Men invited Hittite, not simply for beauty, though their appearance mattered, but because their presence enlivened the room. They broke the monotony of all male debates and brought a playful, unpredictable spark that ignited new lines of thinking. A sharp remark from a clever courtesan could deflate arrogance or redirect a stalled argument more effectively than any amount of wine. These women also held social power. A well-known hater carried connections across cities, households, and political factions. Her support or her criticism could influence a man's reputation more subtly than any speech in the assembly. Some were confidants to generals, lovers to philosophers, or muses to poets whose verses outlived entire city-states. Their role was not merely decorative, it was transformative. They shaped the emotional and intellectual climate of the symposium as much as the wine mixture or the evening's chosen games. Beyond the courtesans, entertainers also played essential roles. Dancers, florists, acrobats, performers brought spectacle to the night, blurring the line between ritual and theater. Their skills added atmosphere, but also contrast. While philosophers sparred over the soul's immortality, a dancer's fluid movement reminded everyone that the body too held its own kind of truth. Importantly, the presence of Hete created a space where desire, intellect, and social performance intertwined. They were not passive guests, but participants who understood the symposium's deeper dynamics. How ideas, egos, and emotions blended into a single, shifting current. Their laughter could lift the room. Their silence could sharpen it. In this alchemy of presence, the symposium became more than a philosophical salon. It became a living ecosystem where gender, intellect, and desire collided in ways that could reshape alliances, inspire art, or alter the course of a man's ambitions. Beneath all the laughter, debate, games, and seduction, the symposium was still a ritual space, one quietly supervised by Dionysus himself. The Greeks did not see drinking as a frivolous act. It was sacred. Wine was a gift from the god who blurred boundaries between joy and madness, order and chaos, mortal and divine. And so every symposium began with a libation, a small offering of wine poured onto the floor or into a designated bowl. This simple gesture reminded everyone that the evening was not purely human. Dionysus watched, Dionysus listened, Dionysus judged. The ritual framed the entire event. It asked guests to drink with intention, not indulgence, to let the wine open their minds, not overwhelm them. The Greeks believed Dionysus granted inspiration, the kind that could touch poetry, philosophy, or even political strategy. A man who drank too much lost that divine spark and fell into foolishness. A man who drank wisely became, in a sense, a vessel for revelation. Moderation, paradoxically, was how one courted the god of ecstasy. Symbols of Dionysus decorated the andron. Ivy crowning the guests, painted kylix showing satyrs tumbling through forests, mosaics of grapevines curling across the floor. These images were not random decor. They were reminders that every guest walked a tightrope between order and excess. The symposium functioned as a controlled descent into Dionysian energy, a safe version of the wild Bacchic rites, refined into an intellectual ritual for the elite. Even the sequence of the evening followed a ritual pattern. Libation, mixing of wine, conversation, music, games, then deeper dialogue as night descended. Each stage mirrored the shifting states of consciousness. Dionysus governed. The god was not invoked with shrieking frenzy, but with laughter, performance, and vulnerability. The Greeks believed that truth, philosophical, emotional, or political, was often revealed only when masks loosened and inhibitions thinned. The symposium created the ideal atmosphere for such revelations. At times, religious themes entered the discussion directly. Myths were retold, dissected, challenged. Was Dionysus truly born twice? Did he bring madness as punishment or as liberation? Did wine free the mind or expose its weaknesses? These questions mingled with the smoke of burning incense, drifting through the room as guests debated the nature of divine influence. Ultimately, the symposium was a balancing act. It embraced a god associated with chaos, but demanded structure. It invited ecstasy, but insisted on intellect. It flirted with madness, but never surrendered to it. In this delicate dance, the Greeks found a way to honor Dionysus without being devoured by him. When dawn crept over the horizon, and the last caix lay empty, the symposium did not end, it transformed. What happened inside those rooms echoed far beyond the wine-stained floors of the andron. The symposium left fingerprints on philosophy, politics, education, art, and even the way modern people gather to share ideas over food and drink. Its legacy stretches across centuries, shaping the very concept of intellectual community. The most obvious legacy lies in Greek philosophy. Many of the dialogues that define Western thought, especially those preserved by Plato, are set at symposia. The relaxed posture, the wine-induced openness, the interplay of humor and logic, concepts like the nature of love, the structure of the soul, and the pursuit of virtue were not forged in solemn temples. They were born among reclining friends, cups in hand, laughter swirling around profound questions. The idea that deep thinking thrives in social spaces, not only in solitude, comes straight from symposium culture. Equally lasting was the symposium's role in shaping political discourse. Greek citizens learned to argue, persuade, and critique in these rooms long before they stepped into the assembly. The freedom to speak one's mind, so central to democratic life, was rehearsed in private before it unfolded in public. Here, men tested their rhetorical skills, challenged norms, and sharpened their understanding of civic issues. The symposium taught them to listen as well as speak, a skill as vital today as it was in ancient Athens. The artistic legacy is just as rich. Vases depicting symposium scenes became iconic works of Greek pottery. capturing everything from elegant reclining figures to mischievous satyrs and drunken raillery. These images provide historians with insight into clothing, furniture, hairstyles, and social behavior. Music and poetry, performed in symposia, influenced genres that survived long after the Greek city-states fell. Even the image of the philosopher with a cup, thoughtful, reflective, slightly amused, remains a recognizable archetype. And what of modern culture? Dining together, drinking together, debating together. These practices, so central to universities, salons, literary circles, and even political gatherings, are direct descendants of symposium culture. The idea that a shared meal creates the perfect environment for honest conversation and creative thought is ancient Greek wisdom embedded in our daily lives. Whether around a dinner table, a cafe, or a quiet bar, people still recreate the essence of the symposium, mixing moderation with indulgence, intellect with laughter, friendship with inquiry. The Greeks believed that wine revealed the truth of a person, but they also believed truth needed companionship to flourish. The symposium honored both, and through its rituals of conversation, performance, and philosophical play, it built a foundation for intellectual life that still shapes how we think, meet, and share ideas today. The wine has long dried, the lyre strings long silent, but the symposium lives on every time minds open over a shared cup. Apollodorus was born in Damascus at a moment in history when the city was more than a crossroads. It was a furnace of ideas. Traders from the Persian East passed through its gates carrying not only fabrics and spices, but knowledge, irrigation techniques, stone-cutting traditions, and mathematical principles. Refined over centuries, Greek settlers brought their own architectural vocabulary, proportions, symmetry, and a belief that beauty was inseparable from geometry. And perched above both influences stood Rome, expanding ever outward, hungry for talent wherever it could find it. Damascus was not just influenced by these worlds, it blended them into something entirely its own. This was the world in which Apollodorus first opened his eyes. From an early age, he was surrounded by stone. Damascus was a city that built with confidence. Its arches were daring, its aqueducts precise, its temples a marriage of local craftsmanship and foreign inspiration. Young Apollodorus watched masons at work the way poets watch sunsets. He studied how water carved its own path through engineered channels and how Persian vaulting techniques allowed structures to rise higher with less material. For him, architecture was never merely construction. It was performance, calculation, and storytelling all at once. His earliest teachers were not philosophers in formal schools, but builders, craftsmen whose hands were calloused from shaping the physical world. They taught him how a single error in measurement could doom an entire structure, and how a well-designed arch could lift more than any human army. These lessons intertwined with Greek texts he studied, treatises on mechanics, geometry, and the sacred proportions of temples. Damascus gave him access to knowledge from every direction, and he absorbed it all like dry stone drinking water. By adolescence, Apollodorus had developed the rarest gift an architect can possess: the ability to imagine in 3 dimensions. He didn't just sketch buildings. He walked through them in his mind, tracing how light would fall at dawn, how crowds would move on festival days, how water would sound as it rushed through hidden channels. His mentors quickly realized they were no longer teaching a student. They were witnessing the rise of a prodigy. In a world where most architects served cities, Apollodorus dreamed of empires. Rome, with its endless appetite for monuments, roads, bridges, and forums, called to him like destiny. And though he did not yet know it, his Syrian Greek upbringing and the Persian engineering legacy beneath it would one day reshape the capital of the Roman world itself. When Apollodorus finally made his way westward, Rome was not simply a city. It was a construction site on the scale of a civilization. The Flavian dynasty had just completed the Colosseum. The Forum was a perpetual work in progress, and emperors were competing to outdo their predecessors with larger, taller, and more technically demanding monuments. Rome devoured marble, swallowed stone, and burned through architects faster than most cities went through grain. It was the perfect place for a mind like Apollodorus to detonate. Yet, Rome was also notoriously hostile. Syrian Greek architects were not supposed to outshine Roman-born engineers. They were expected to obey, not innovate. But Apollodorus was not built for quiet competence. He walked into the capital with the confidence of a man who understood precisely what he could offer. Designs Rome had never seen, techniques rooted in Persian and Near Eastern engineering, and a mathematical boldness that could push Roman architecture beyond its limits. Rome did not need another draftsman. It needed a visionary, and Apollodorus stepped into that role effortlessly. He didn't begin with grand monuments. At first, his contributions were practical: improved bridge designs, more efficient military fortifications, and innovations in the mechanics of siege engines. Trajan, still a rising military commander, noticed immediately. Apollodorus' solutions were not theoretical. They worked in the field. Where other engineers hesitated, he calculated. Where others proposed, he executed. And where others accepted the limits of Roman building traditions, Apollodorus reached back into the engineering knowledge of Persia and the Hellenistic world, pulling out techniques Rome had never considered. This partnership, Trajan, the soldier, and Apollodorus, the architect, became one of the most powerful alliances in Roman history. Trajan valued talent more than pedigree, and Apollodorus valued patrons who understood ambition. Together, they reshaped the empire, starting not in marble forums, but on dusty frontiers where roads, bridges, and war machines meant survival. With each success, Apollodorus climbed higher in Trajan's circle. By the time Trajan ascended the imperial throne in 98 CE, Apollodorus was no longer just a gifted architect. He was the emperor's chief engineer, his trusted advisor, and the man Trajan believed capable of turning imperial ambition into stone. In Rome, a city overflowing with talent, Apollodorus had not simply arrived, he had conquered. When Trajan became emperor, Rome gained more than a ruler, it gained a builder. And at the center of this imperial transformation stood Apollodorus, no longer merely an architect from Damascus, but the creative engine behind Rome's next great era. Trajan wanted monuments that spoke of power, efficiency, and legitimacy. Apollodorus wanted projects that stretched the limits of Roman engineering. Their ambitions collided perfectly. The first grand undertaking was infrastructure: roads, harbors, and above all, bridges. Rome's armies needed mobility, and Apollodorus provided it with a mastery that stunned even veteran commanders. His bridges were not simple crossings. They were strategic weapons made of timber, stone, and mathematical ingenuity. None was more impressive than the bridge over the Danube, a structure so bold, so unapologetically monumental, that it defied the natural barrier which had long protected Dia from Rome. Built in record time, supported by massive stone piers, Apollodorus' Danube Bridge effectively erased a river from the map. For Trajan, this meant war. For Apollodorus, it meant immortality. But his contributions didn't stop at military feats. Apollodorus crafted siege engines that improved accuracy and range, reimagined defensive fortifications, and refined artillery mechanisms that allowed Roman legions to take cities others could not reach. These were not theoretical designs. They were practical, brutal tools forged from his understanding of geometry and physics, knowledge rooted in Persian and Hellenistic traditions far older than Rome itself. Trajan saw an Apollodor as someone who could give physical form to imperial ideology. Victory was no longer enough. It had to be seen. It had to be felt. Architecture became propaganda, and Apollodorus became the hand that carved Trajan's legacy into the skyline of the capital. This synergy, Trajan's military expansion and Apollodorus' architectural genius, reshaped Rome more deeply than any partnership since Augustus and Agra. Together, they built the infrastructure of expansion, the tools of conquest, and the monumental spaces that would later define Roman identity. Yet Apollodorus was not content with practical brilliance alone. He had a larger vision simmering beneath every calculation to create a monument so vast, so precise, and so symbolically powerful that it would rewrite the architectural language of the empire. The opportunity came with Trajan's greatest military triumph, the defeat of Dacia. What Apollodorus created next would make even Rome gasp. If Rome was the capital of the world, then the Forum of Trajan was the capital of Rome. When Apollodorus was commissioned to design it, he was not asked to build a plaza. He was asked to redefine what an imperial public space could be. The result was a masterpiece of impossible scale, breathtaking coherence, and architectural intelligence so advanced that modern engineers still marvel at it. Trajan defeated with military brilliance. Apollodorus commemorated that victory with stone, geometry, and a vision that lifted the city into a new age. The site chosen for the forum was cramped and uneven, a massive ridge of land-blocked expansion. Most architects would have adjusted their design. Apollodorus simply removed the hill. Under his direction, tens of thousands of workers carved away millions of cubic meters of earth and rock, an engineering feat rivaling any ancient wonder. Only once the land was cleared did the true project begin. A vast, open courtyard surrounded by colonnades, a basilica larger than any yet built, libraries, statues, arches, and Trajan's column rising like a marble flame at its center. The proportions were deliberate. Apollodorus understood how Romans moved through space, how crowds flowed, how ceremonial processions required grandeur without confusion. The Forum of Trajan was not chaotic. It was choreographed. Each structure was placed to echo another. The libraries flanking the column symbolized the emperor's wisdom. The Basilica Julia served as the empire's administrative heart, blending Greek aesthetic harmony with Roman legal authority. Even the colossal equestrian statue of Trajan, shimmering with gilded bronze, was positioned to be the first thing a visitor saw upon entering. A reminder that power and order radiated from the emperor himself. And then there was Trajan's column. Its spiraling relief told the story of the Dion Wars with a precision normally reserved for manuscripts. Soldiers crossing bridges, engineers building fortifications, generals addressing the troops, all rendered with Apollodorus's intimate understanding of warfare and logistics. Some scholars believe he personally directed the narrative, using his first-hand experience to shape Rome's visual memory of the conflict. But what truly made the Forum extraordinary was its fusion of traditions: Persian engineering, Greek symmetry, and Roman monumentalism were woven into a single architectural language. Apollodorus did not copy cultures, he synthesized them, elevating each into something greater. His Forum was a city within a city, a physical argument for Rome's claim to universal rule. In building it, Apollodorus reached the height of his influence. But heights in Rome were always dangerous. If the Forum of Trajan was a statement of imperial glory, then the markets of Trajan were a statement of Apollodorus's genius. Attached to the Forum like a living organism, the markets sprawled across the slope of the Quirin hill in tiered layers of brick, arches, and vated halls. But this was no simple commercial district. What Apollodorus built was arguably the world's first multifunctional shopping and administrative complex. A structure so advanced in design and so modern in concept that it feels shockingly familiar today. The challenge was enormous. He had to tame the steep, irregular hillside and turn it into a harmonious, functioning space. Lesser architects would have fought the terrain. Apollodorus embraced it. He carved into the hill, creating massive retaining walls and staggered platforms that transformed a natural obstacle into architectural opportunity. Instead of resisting the land's shape, he sculpted it into a cascading network of levels that maximized usable space while maintaining structural stability. This principle, merging engineering necessity with elegant form, came straight from Near Eastern building traditions he absorbed in Damascus. The lower levels of the markets were bustling with activity: food vendors, wine shops, spice dealers, textile merchants, and small booths selling everything from lamps to scrolls. These were arranged along a broad street now known as the Via Biberatica, which wound through the complex like a spine. The street was shaded, airy, and perfectly engineered to transport both goods and gossip efficiently through the district. Apollodorus understood flow of people, of commerce, of Roman life, and he designed accordingly. Above the shops were offices, storage rooms, and administrative chambers. Roman bureaucrats worked in spaces that could have existed in a modern government building, bright, ventilated, and logically arranged. Upper terraces offered panoramic views of the newly completed Forum, allowing merchants and officials alike to gaze out over Trajan's architectural crown jewel. The markets were not just commercial, they were political, social, and symbolic. But Apollodorus didn't rely solely on function. He infused beauty into every curve and corridor. Brickwork was laid with mathematical precision. Arches were framed to catch sunlight dramatically at certain hours. Semicircular halls created acoustics ideal for public announcements. Even the smallest details reflected his belief that engineering and aesthetics were two sides of the same coin. Rome had never seen anything like it. Visitors walked through the markets in awe, not just because of what they could buy, but because the very building felt like a living testament to imperial order and prosperity. Apollodorus had taken the mundane act of shopping and elevated it into a civic experience. The markets cemented his reputation as the empire's most innovative architect, but admiration was not universal. In a city of envy, genius attracted dangerous attention. Before Apollodorus carved his genius into Rome's skyline, he carved it into the very mechanics of war. Trajan's Dion campaigns were not won by soldiers alone. They were won by terrain mastery, logistical superiority, and engineering. So advanced, it rendered natural obstacles meaningless. Behind much of that engineering stood Apollodorus, wielding geometry as decisively as any general wielded a sword. The Danube River had long shielded Dia like a moat. Most Roman commanders treated it as a seasonal nuisance, crossable only with temporary pontoon bridges, always at the mercy of the current. Apollodorus, however, saw the Danube not as a barrier, but as a solvable equation. His solution was the famed Danube Bridge, a structure of unprecedented scale resting on colossal stone piers driven deep into the riverbed, stretching more than a kilometer across roaring water. It wasn't just a bridge. It was Rome declaring that even nature bowed before imperial will. Constructing it required synchronized brilliance. Divers sealed wooden cuisines underwater. Masons shaped stone blocks to tolerances few believed possible. Timber specialists engineered an interlocking superstructure that resisted both current and ice. Apollodorus orchestrated them all, blending Roman resources with techniques inherited from Persian and Hellenistic hydraulic traditions. When it was complete, Rome marched armies across it as easily as a man stepping over a stream. Dia had lost its greatest shield, but the bridge was only one part of his war genius. Apollodorus redesigned battering rams, siege towers, and ballast, optimizing tension, trajectory, and stability. He introduced improvements to tudo formations by calculating ideal shield curvature. He refined artillery so Roman projectiles flew farther and struck harder. These innovations did not merely assist the Roman legions, they transformed them into a precision machine. Siege warfare, too, bore his touch. At fortified Dean hilltops, where steep slopes frustrated ordinary engineers, Apollodorus devised terracing systems and counterslope roads that allowed Roman siege towers to climb impossible gradients. Where others saw cliffs, he saw leverage. Where commanders hesitated, he pointed to mathematical solutions etched in the dirt. Trajan trusted him completely, often consulting Apollodorus during strategic planning. Not because the architect worshipped war, but because he understood structure of landscapes, of cities, of empires. In Apollodorus's eyes, a battlefield was simply a broken design waiting to be reconfigured. Victory in D brought Trajan everlasting fame. It brought Apollodorus something else. A reputation so brilliant it would soon threaten the ego of another emperor. Apollodorus reached the height of his career under Trajan, but Rome was an empire where one man's rise could become another man's threat. And when Trajan died in 117 CE, the architect, who had helped shape the most expansive phase of Roman power, found himself serving, not by choice, the new emperor, Hadrian. At first, the transition appeared smooth. Hadrian admired architecture, loved Greek culture, and wanted to continue Trajan's legacy of monumental building. One might assume he and Apollodorus would form a natural creative partnership. But Hadrian was not Trajan. He was not a soldier, emperor, but an athletely intellectual, deeply sensitive, and crucially, deeply insecure. Where Trajan valued Apollodorus's brilliance, Hadrian felt overshadowed by it. The emperor fancied himself an architect, yet he lacked the technical mastery Apollodorus wielded effortlessly. The Syrian Greek master did not soften his opinions. He corrected the emperor openly. He dismissed Hadrian's early design sketches as the work of an amateur, accurate perhaps, but politically suicidal. One story preserved in later sources recounts that Hadrian proudly showed Apollodorus his design for a temple. Apollodorus reportedly answered with brutal honesty. Be off and draw pumpkins. You know nothing about this. Whether the account is literal or exaggerated, its moral is clear. Apollodorus embarrassed a man who could not afford to be embarrassed. Hadrian never forgot it. The first crack in their relationship appeared when Apollodorus criticized Hadrian's beloved architectural obsession, the Pantheon's rebuilding. While Hadrian oversaw the project, Apollodorus allegedly pointed out structural flaws and corrections Hadrian failed to consider. The emperor seethed. Advisors warned Apollodorus. He was a builder who spoke the truth, Stone demanded. When political tension finally erupted, it was swift and silent. Hadrian dismissed Apollodorus from all imperial projects, stripping him of access to the architectural heart of Rome. The man who once commanded armies of workers was suddenly unwelcome in the very city he helped reinvent. The Syrian Greek architect who had shaped the empire's greatest forum was exiled, not for treason, not for corruption, but for brilliance perceived as insubordination, and exile was only the beginning. Hadrian's resentment simmered, deepening into paranoia. A man of Apollodorus's talent, influence, and uncompromising nature was too dangerous to leave alive. The empire he had built monuments for would soon turn those monuments into silent witnesses to his downfall. Once Apollodorus fell from Hadrian's favor, his world collapsed with terrifying speed. A man whose designs had reshaped Rome itself was suddenly uprooted, stripped of imperial protection, and cast out from the circles of influence he had once commanded. Exile for an architect was not just a physical removal from the capital. It was the severing of his hands from the stone that defined his identity. Apollodorus had been the mind behind Trajan's greatest monuments. Now he wandered in enforced obscurity, carrying the knowledge that his genius had become his greatest liability. Hadrian's motives were never officially declared. The emperor wrapped his decisions in vague political justifications, hinting that Apollodorus had overstepped his station, spoken too boldly, criticized too freely. But everyone close to the imperial court understood the truth. Hadrian could not bear a rival. Apollodorus was not simply an architect. He was a symbol of Trajan's era, a reminder that the empire had once been shaped by a different vision, and Hadrian, who desperately wanted to be seen as an intellectual equal, could not tolerate the presence of someone whose expertise highlighted his own limitations. In exile, Apollodorus continued sketching ideas, imagining structures that would never rise from the ground. His notebooks, long since lost, were said to contain designs for harbors, arches, military engines, and hydraulic systems far ahead of their time. But no emperor would commission them. No workshop would carve them. His genius was locked behind political bars, visible only to himself. The end came quietly, but with imperial deliberation. Ancient sources claim Hadrian eventually ordered Apollodorus's execution using a fabricated charge as justification. The method is unknown. The motive is unmistakable. Hadrian wanted Apollodorus erased, not merely removed from Rome, but removed from memory. To a ruler who styled himself as philosopher and architect, allowing a superior mind to exist was a constant humiliation. And so the greatest builder of Trajan's reign died, far from the monuments he had created. No inscription marked the place, no column rose in his honor. The man who had carved a new Rome into existence was granted only silence. Yet even in death, Apollodorus defied erasure. His buildings remained immense, immovable, undeniable. The markets, the forum, the column, the bridges. They stood as stone witnesses, refusing to let his memory vanish under imperial insecurity. Hadrian could exile the architect, he could silence him, he could even kill him, but he could not unbuild what Apollodorus had given the world. Apollodorus died without honors, without a public funeral, without the recognition he deserved. Yet, in a twist of history more poetic than any triumphal inscription, the very empire that tried to silence him ended up preserving him in the only language he ever cared about: architecture. Rome may have erased his name from statues and records, but it could not erase the structures built by his mind. They still stand today, commanding the skyline, defying time, and revealing the fingerprints of a Syrian-Greek genius who shaped the Roman world more deeply than most emperors ever did. The Forum of Trajan remains one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of antiquity, its scale unmatched, its planning unrivaled. The Basilica Julia influenced civic architecture for millennia. Trajan's column continues to spiral upward in perfect balance, its reliefs offering historians not only military narrative, but technological insight into Roman engineering and the markets of Trajan. They remain in many ways the prototype of the modern urban complex. Multifunctional, interconnected, designed for the flow of crowds and commerce. They embody principles that contemporary architects still rely on. His influence crossed continents and centuries. Byzantine builders adopted his vaulted structures. Islamic architects echoed his mastery of domes and spatial flow, especially in regions neighboring his Syrian homeland. Renaissance masters studied his proportions, admired his clarity, and borrowed his solutions. Even modern architectural engineering, reinforced arches, tiered complexes, adaptive designs in challenging terrain can trace intellectual lineage back to Apollodorus' innovations. But perhaps the most profound part of his legacy is the way it exposes the cultural fiction at the heart of Rome's self-image. Roman architecture is often presented as purely Roman, born in Italy, perfected by emperors, exported across the Mediterranean. Apollodorus shatters that myth. His life is proof that Rome's greatest monuments were shaped by the fusion of Greek thought, Syrian craftsmanship, and Persian engineering traditions. He is a reminder that empires rise not through isolation, but through the genius they absorb from the world around them. Polydorus also stands as a quiet warning about the price of brilliance in autocratic systems. His life shows that talent can elevate an empire, but it can also threaten those who wield power without humility. Hadrian's insecurity erased the man, but it could not erase the truth. Apollodorus built an empire more lasting than politics, for in stone he found immortality, and in every arch, every vault, every calculated line of his surviving works, Apollodorus of Damascus still speaks more eloquently than any emperor who tried to silence him.